Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation on in our Collegiate Recovery webinar series. My name's Olivia Pinelli, and I'm your host today. We're joined by Keith Murphy of Rutgers University. The topic for today's presentation is creating anti-racist and liberated collegiate recovery programs. These webinars are hosted by the Association of Recovery in Higher Education in order to support the growth and development of the collegiate recovery field. Just a few reminders and logistics items before we turn things over to Keith. Today's webinar will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube and the ARHE website. You'll be able to go back and access all the information at that time. If you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your window. There'll be a time at the end for Q&A, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. Supplemental materials will be provided from the presenter, such as slides, which you should see on your screen now. And we can also email those out to webinar registrants. If you have any technical difficulties or any logistical questions, please feel free to message us through the chat box and direct message to all panelists if you can. We're always looking for more ways to improve, topics to cover, and any other feedback from our attendees. So please feel free to reach out to us at any time and let us know about your experience today. Now to turn things over to Keith. Keith Murphy is a licensed professional counsellor and a licensed clinical alcohol and drug counsellor in New Jersey. He has over 14 years of experience in helping those who struggle with addiction and other major life issues rebuild their lives. In his present role as a recovery counsellor, Keith has been tasked to help students in the Collegiate Recovery Programme develop skills for life in college and beyond. As a member of Rutgers counselling staff, Keith has the privilege of seeing students flourish and become world changers. Thanks for joining us today, Keith, and over to you.
Thanks for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for that wonderful bio. I like that bio because I wrote it. No, I'm kidding.
It was great.
It's really good. We're going to not do necessarily a deep dive into this topic. This is something that I'm passionate about. I care a great deal about. If you know me, you've heard me talk about this for quite some time. Just bear in mind that what you're seeing on your screen are my slides and my notes. And I'm also using this new thing that's on PowerPoint that will that provides subtitles for folks. So it'll just kind of transcribe what I'm saying and put up there for those who are hard of hearing. Again, the title of this webinar is Creating Anti-Racist and Liberated Collegiate Recovery Programs. Now, if I could go back, and I could change it, and I probably will, would be Creating Anti-Racist and Liberated Collegiate Recovery Programs with anti-oppression in mind would probably be my new title. For the record, as my notes say, I use he, him, and his as pronouns. I am from Morristown, New Jersey. I have a wife and a dog. I'm a person that's in long-term recovery, and I've been in long-term recovery for almost 20 years now. Bear in mind that a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about for some folks is going to be absolutely new. Some of the stuff will be bothersome and triggering. The thing that I encourage all people to do as they listen and participate in this webinar is quite simply this, is to participate. Pay attention to your body, pay attention to what's happening with you inside your person, whether you recoil, whether you get cold hands, or whether your heart races, or whether you become nervous, or whether you lean into this material, or you give me a couple yeses and some amens. But just be aware of what's going on with you psychically, emotionally, and physically, because a lot of this work here is, can be unpleasant for some because it's new and it really confronts them where they're at. So there you go. That's the first slide. Now I'm going to move it along. Just bear with me. You're going to catch my notes. Okay. So the first thing here that we're going to talk about here is creating a space for discussion. The next thing is obviously lay out goals and objectives, and a quick activity. I'm going to ask if you can find a pen, a paper really fast. I'll give you a minute for that, but not an actual minute, maybe some time. And then hopefully at the end, we'll jump into some continued discussion. I will say this, and I will firmly land on this. This is a we discussion. This is not a me discussion. This is not about me giving you answers to solve all of the racial inequity issues in your CRP or in your college campus. That is not my role, that is not my function, nor is that my ability or my power to do. If I were able to do that, the world would be a much better place. Not putting myself on a pedestal, but I'm just saying I just don't have that power. This is something that's totally different, and it's a collective thing. So this is part of a continued discussion. First things first, obviously I do this in groups, and first thing is safety is key. Safety trumps all. If someone is not safe, they will not trust, and if they will not trust, they will not share. So as you engage in this discussion about racism, heterosexism, ableism, cissexism, classism, elitism, all the isms, or some of the isms here in collegiate recovery programs, be aware that this may evoke, and I don't say provoke, I say evoke, draw out of you strong feelings due to some internalized privileges or prejudice that you may have carried, some past experiences or histories, or because you've got friends or families with divergent beliefs, or other things. Now, bear in mind that we all walk into every situation with a history, with an idea of how the world should be. Now, I want everyone to bear in mind that a lot of what we believe, we have been conditioned and socialized to believe, okay? So a lot of what we have anchored our lives on have been reinforced in positive and a lot of negative ways. So what I'm asking you to do is have an open mind and be aware of like, oh, some things that you thought were actually fixed or anchored, but also things that can be challenged, okay? So first thing here is creating a braver space. We have to come up with some group agreements here. And the first one is listen to learn and learn to listen. Obviously, it's a webinar. It's different than obviously a presentation, and obviously I'm doing most of the talking, but if you're a person that's prone to kind of like to ask a lot of questions, learn to listen a little bit more. Learn to sit back in your space. And that's step up, step back. If you're a person that's prone to like kind of sit back and not say anything, I encourage you to kind of put those questions out there, because unanswered questions lead to shame, and shame grows in the shadow of white supremacy and oppressive culture. Here, no one knows everything. Together we know a lot, and I think that's self-explanatory. No one experience is greater than the sum parts. Nevertheless, we can come together and build a coalition and learn together. I think that's absolutely key for the work that we're doing. Again, this obviously was done in a live thing, but move up, meaning this. If you're a person that's like inclined to step back, move up, press up, and lean into this work, because it's good, and in some ways it can be fun, and it can also be very enlightening, and hopefully it can be liberating. The initial part of this work will be very, very uncomfortable, because you may see things and experience things that you may have dismissed before, and become more aware of like how systems operate to keep certain people locked out of power and influence, and making positive and good changes for all. This is the other thing. We can't expect people to be articulate all the time. Don't expect people to have clear and cogent arguments against every piece of, and I'm going to use a lot of different terms like white supremacy or sexism or homophobia and stuff like that. Don't expect people, because this is a really passionate thing, and for a long time people have been oppressed and not been able to speak their mind freely. So I'm going to ask that not people be perfect in this thing, but be aware that not every argument or everything that's going to be said is going to be so cogent that it's going to be like, oh, it's perfectly clear. Just learn how to sit with that. Embrace curiosity, be aware of your triggers, and this is key, be transparent. Again, white supremacy, oppression grows in secrecy and shame. So I'm asking you to be that person, to be transparent. And being transparent means revealing your intentions to folks. Like, what do you want to learn, and how come you want to learn it? And that helps disarm a lot of the negative, it makes conversation a lot easier. And then take responsibility for your words. Acknowledge the difference between intent and impact. Oftentimes we want people to measure us by our intentions rather than the impact of what we say and how we say it. And I know for some people this is all old hat, this is not really new stuff, but like, I just feel like I need to lay out the groundwork for us to have a really fluid and dynamic discussion. Confidentiality is key. Obviously, it's a webinar. It's going to be on YouTube. You could talk about what you shared, but I'll ask that you be mindful of not repeating what other people have shared out of context because it's not fair. And the last part is allow your humanity to give and show space to be vulnerable and allow others to be vulnerable. So there's a lot of heavy lifting, and it's not all on me. This is all mostly on you here. And hopefully you can see me. I can't see you. This is a quick video. I've shown this video before in the past, and I think it really encapsulates some of the stuff that goes on, especially on college campuses. This is a little piece that was done by the New York Times some years back about racial microaggressions. So I'm going to click play, sit back, and let you watch the video. And then at the end, we're going to move forward, okay?
We face a different generation of racism than our parents did. Things were much more blatant, so it was easy to say, that's racist, you're racist, this is a racist institution. But we're facing things that you're like, okay, am I crazy, or do they just do this? And so it kind of, we internalize a lot.
Yeah. Does anyone have, y'all are, I love it, the dedication.
This is Tanzina Vega reporting for the New York Times. At the Lowell Lecture Hall in Cambridge, crowds gathered to see I Too Am Harvard, a one-night performance put on by students who feel marginalized at the university.
Does anyone actually have physical tickets in their hands?
Like, people think we're just gung-ho. Like, no, there were times we didn't want to do this because it made us really like uncomfortable and have to face things and have to face people that we were not like prepared to.
The play was based on a student interview project and Tumblr page, also called I Too Am Harvard. The project focuses on tiny, offhand comments, the kind that can seem innocent, but can really sting under the surface.
At the beginning of the year, introducing myself to people, sometimes people would take a step back and be like, wait, what are you?
They're called microaggressions, and younger generations are increasingly responding to them.
I came from Connecticut.
The microaggressions that I encounter are simply people who don't realize my racial background and who really question it. So, are you really Asian? Can I see a photo of your mother?
Microaggression is an academic term that's been around for decades. But recently it's taken root in social media campaigns as students across the country are questioning whether their generation is indeed colorblind.
It's important to have the vocabulary to be able to describe your lived experiences in order to feel like they're justified, because people are always trying to dismiss them.
Right.
We have to show that these little daily microaggressions are just sort of the little bubbling up of greater racial tensions that are underlying this whole post-racial, if we have this post-racial surface, there's all of these extreme racial tensions underneath the surface where people are like, oh, we have a black president, we're post-racial, but still it's okay to shoot a child just for having black skin.
You don't know how to respond. You don't want to make it a big deal, but it is. And you almost regret some of those moments.
There might be a comment that I don't want to think too much into because I'll rather just ignore it and then move on. But that's why I really enjoy the play, to see those that aren't necessarily ignoring it but trying to do something about it.
Why do you ignore it? Why do you ignore it when someone says
it's always easier to ignore.
To be clear, there's a risk in calling out microaggressions. Some worry it can make a situation more uncomfortable. And critics say these student campaigns are an overreaction to unintended offenses. But for some, conversations like these are a good reminder to be more aware.
As a social worker who's gone through many lessons of racism and sexism, where people think they're experts but they're not, and don't recognize that it's a lifetime of learning and a lifetime of interactions where you continue to learn and grow. I felt like it was an enormous opportunity to be reminded once again of what's real.
So with that, I put some questions up there. Oops, backwards. Why is this necessary? any of this new, like new language, and then your reactions. It would be great if you could throw some of those things up in the chat, and we could talk about them hopefully later. And moving along. Okay, I'm going to go into some infographics here, and I'll go into a little bit a part of my own story as we roll forward. And oftentimes, and I have these infographics up, and hopefully you can see them, I'll throw them up a little bit larger. It's easy to see the overt signs and symbols of oppression, you know, like the hostile sexist, the free for chubbies, did you ever see a fat Chinese, so on and so forth. These are super, super problematic. And in most cases, most people will be like, oh my gosh, those are terrible things to say. And in some respects, people will be like, oh, you know, kind of get over it. These things are funny. This is how things used to be. We're not like that anymore. But this is how we were advertised to. And if we see if we look at little simple things like the Van Heusen shirts, who is at the top of the pyramid in terms of what is to be desired? We look at who is being controlled, who is being manipulated, who is not good enough here. And the product and the part of capitalism and advertising psychology is to find a need that people have and then use your product to fill that need. So clearly, men need to feel better about being white and in control. White men, they need to be in control of women. Women obviously have to be desirable towards and for men. Children need to be comforted all the time, especially with a gun in a bed. Obviously, there's clearly something defective or wrong about being Black. Therefore, it's Elliot's white veneer. And then obviously, do you ever see a fat Chinese, which is just like, again, beyond racist. And it's funny, not funny, haha, but funny, ironic that like, what's old is kind of new again. You know, the idea of always being able to find another group to denigrate is a key holding of white supremacy. It's always the other group is defective, the other group is dirty, the other group needs to be fixed. And clearly, white America has the products to make these people and make lives much better. For me, I'll park on the hostile sexist and the benevolent sexist. I was a benevolent sexist. I'll say I'm a benevolent sexist in recovery in terms of holding the door open for women, calling women love or dear, refusing to split a bill, you know, just being that guy that's a savior for women as if women can't do for themselves. And that's something that I've learned from my father because that's what he learned. Because that's what white supremacy is. It's just like women are fragile. Women can't think for themselves. So it's my job as some kind of Superman savior to be there for them at all times. And I thought I was being a good person, but in fact, I was really being dismissive of women and not understanding that they have power too. The flip side of that, and it's something that's not often talked about, especially in the Black community, especially for Black men and women, is that I expected my mom to be a superhero type woman, to be impervious to pain, always suffering to make things better for the family and being devoid of her own feelings and emotions. She's her own person and has her own thoughts and her own feelings. It wasn't until I got older to find out that like, oh my God, and I'll say this, oh, like mommy, you dated other men. You just didn't wake up and marry my dad. She had a whole other life, but that's part of the immaturity, but that's also a part of the sexist world in which I lived, and that like my parents were magically put together. And that's what I saw in Hollywood. And that's what I saw represented all the time. It's just that like women were not to be valued. They were there to be possessed. Again, I'm gonna go back just not to harp on this slide. We know where we're at. We know what we're dealing with. And again, modern versus overt prejudice. Again, if you know anything about the Make America Great slogan, it was something that Ronald Reagan had said actually as a part of his campaign in the Deep South. Actually, when talking about states' rights, there's a great history behind why he made that slogan and why he said it. But there's this again, the American myth of America being great at this particular period of time. And the joke is, was it 1850? Was it 1950? Or was it 1750 or 1619? When was this period that America was great? So part of understanding the world in which we live, and again, it's putting this all in context, is the idea of traditional values and traditional things, that there's no such thing as tradition. Everything that we believe has been cultivated and shaped so that we fall in line with the idea of one, supremacy, and supremacy feeds on capitalism, and that has seeped into all of our major institutions. In fact, that is the bedrock of all of our institutions, and it in turn has been carried out in much of collegiate recovery on a micro and on a macro level. This is one of my favorite things here is, this is a quick activity. If you have time, take a note card or a piece of paper. On one side of that line, piece of paper, write all of your social identities, male, female, non-binary, whatever, just list them all out. And just take about a couple minutes to do that. You can do that while I'm even talking, and then look at which identity is more salient to you. The identity that's most salient to me is being Black. The next one is being male. Which identity is less salient? Is that being, for example, a college graduate, maybe less salient? And then jumping into which identity raises some anxiety. Have you ever felt unsafe because of one or more of your identities? And then the last question is, which social identities seem to generate some inner conflict? Take your time and sort through that. And the reason I ask you to sort that out is understanding that conflict. Those are the things that we bring into each situation. And the two things that we bring into every situation, first and foremost, right, is gender and race. Every time, full stop. And I always like to throw in this Audre Lorde quote, is somewhere on the edge of consciousness, there's what I call the mythical norm, which each of us within our hearts knows that is not me. In America, this norm is usually defined as white, thin, male, young, heterosexual, Christian, and financially secure. It is with this mythical norm that the trappings of power reside within society. Those of us who stand outside that power often identify in one way in which we are different, meaning we identify other than. We assume that to be the primary cause of all oppression, forgetting all other distortions around difference, some of which we ourselves may be practicing. That's Audre Lorde. So basically understanding how our identities influence our values, our expressive communication style, how we listen, how we put information out, how we're receptive to the world, the lens through which we see the world, the expectations you have of the world, and the ideas in which, or the modes and methods in which you use to execute your ideas. This is something that I throw out there to, and I say this ironically, obligatory out of context MLK quotes. These are often quotes that I've had thrown back at me oftentimes by white folks who've never read anything about Martin Luther King Jr. and try and tell me what he's all about. Usually MLK quotes come up in tough racial conversations when a white person is trying to white-splain something to me about what it means to get over being Black or what it means to be an American. So they always go to the Martin Luther King who was co-opted and misquoted and misused to make their own agenda about how I need to stay in my place, because he was the good, quote unquote, Negro. He was the one that was about, bringing folks together, but dismissing his stance on being called one of the communists, being the least popular Black man in the country, being assassinated, politically assassinated, being actually assassinated, his war on poverty, his war on not just school desegregation, but making schools equitable and fair for not just Black folks, but all people who are marginalized. So again, I like to throw this up to make some people feel better about themselves at times, because Martin Luther King's a hero of mine, but people often don't understand who he is or what he's about. Now, going back to the identity piece, there's a thing called intersectionality. This term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a law professor at UCLA and Columbia, and she talks about it as a metaphor to talk about how identities are compounded and how to discuss relationships between people in history and other identities. Now, again, that's not me, that's Kimberly Crenshaw. And oftentimes people misunderstand the idea of intersectionality. When they think of intersectionality, they simply talk about the intersection of different identities. But what she's talking about, again, like the quote here from Patricia Hill Collins, is an interlocking systems of oppression. How being a Black person and a Black woman are also intersections, but how both of those identities can have dual oppressions happening. For example, it took a long time for feminists to understand that there are also Black feminists as well who were deeply tied to the movement. It took them a while, other feminists, to realize that, oh, a lot of this movement, a lot of this work was already being done by Black women. So the idea that Black women and Black feminists with their identities, like, one, they could do some different work, but like white women for a long time who were feminists felt like they were the only ones doing this work, dismissing the power and what Black women were bringing. I'm going to skip through some of this stuff, just going through goals and objectives, understand what is inclusion, diversity, equity, and I put this on the side here, not to learn to hate the words inclusion and equity, but really to learn to hate the words inclusion and diversity. I'll come back to that. Now back to the crux of our talk here is, why do collegiate recovery programs need to be centered in liberation? That's the key here. What is discrimination? Some people like to use stigma, discrimination. I like discrimination a little bit better because stigma kind of talks about a mark, a prejudice that really doesn't carry the same weight, and even discrimination doesn't actually carry the weight, because I see this actually as a life or death kind of work. So for me, it's about people being able to come to a space where they can live and thrive. And if they're not allowed to be in that space fully and freely, it's going to kill them. And you're like, well, you're saying too much, but I absolutely and positively believe that. The other part of this work here is challenge ourselves to grow and understand the value of diversity and equity. Again, I'll show you stuff about diversity and equity, but I believe in more about equity and justice, and that's been an evolution in my life, and being a part of this work and doing some self-work and listening to other folks who've been doing this for a long time and being in certain circles where I'm being challenged to come out of my comfort zone. So I'm not asking you to do anything that I have not been done or continue to do myself, because it's necessary. Boom. Understand our own cultural biases and how they come into play in our professional life. That is actually key if you are helping to manage a collegiate recovery program, if you are just living your day-to-day life, and if you really believe in doing the work of liberating folks to help them to be the full people that they could possibly be, you have to be about this work. Full stop. Anything short of that, you are continuing the cycle of oppression. And if you are not about doing that work, you need to step down. Boom. Next part, identify opportunities to change the status quo and remove barriers for collegiate recovery programs. Again, it's all part of that self-work. It's also part of the larger work that we need to do as being change agents, because one, we didn't get into or being involved in collegiate recovery with the idea of things staying the same. Because status quo has kept many, many folks out of getting the help that they need. Recognize the importance of reaching out to the underrepresented people. I mean, that goes without saying. Centering collegiate recovery programs and equity. Here's what we know. Substance use disorders and mental illness does not discriminate. However, the treatment and who gets treatment and how that treatment is delivered definitely is tainted in morality, right? And is definitely steeped in racism and sexism and oppression. So we need to bear that in mind. And not to go to a totally different tangent, but a lot of the stuff that's going on today with COVID-19 and Black folks feeling the impact of COVID-19, but people not asking the why, is part of what's going on. Is a lot of parallels in the healthcare field with, one, substance use disorders, recovery, healthcare treatment, and how Black people are viewed. Part of the problem in many oppressive spaces is that the victim, quote unquote, is blamed for their misgivings or what's going on in their lives. For example, Black folks deal with hypertension, diabetes, poor diet, obesity, so on and so forth. They need to get their lives right. And the fact that their rates are much higher in terms of being affected by COVID-19, for example, is because they don't know how to they don't know how to practice social distancing. Not paying attention to one, people have lack of access to adequate, consistent, and quality healthcare. We could talk about redlining. We could talk about other income disparities in the state, in the country, and in the state of New Jersey. We could talk about how Black and brown folks are policed in their respective neighborhoods, how people are being confined to prisons, and most of those people are Black and brown folks and are disproportionately impacted by this disease, by COVID-19 and the disease of mass incarceration. So understand that we're in a system that doesn't actually work to liberate folks. It works to oppress folks, and that seeps into our collegiate recovery programs, even with all of our best intentions. I'm gonna skip over this old information about collegiate recovery programs being mostly white, mostly women. One of the things that I wish I'd done sooner was actually and this is working towards change, and I give people a lot of credit who are doing this work to make change, is being aware that being intentional about finding folks who ordinarily would not come into our collegiate recovery programs. And not just talking the talk, but actually walking the walk, having policies that are reflective of of having anti-oppressive language, understanding what pronouns mean, being aware that people evolve and people change. How a person comes into recovery may be different than how they leave in terms of their gender expression, their sexual orientation, and us being aware of it, being humble and being collaborative and working collectively with our students, which is different than how white supremacy works, because white supremacy works from the top down, dictating orders. But the idea that we're trying to do is work collectively and help students get better. And in turn, we make the world a better place. Next slide, we've seen this slide beat to death. There's another part of this whole slide here about equality and equity. There's also a part here, someone added to it. The original author who put this together just kind of let it go across the internet, where now people have taken down the fence and gotten rid of the boxes to show that it's not just about equality or equity, it's also about justice. Understand the idea of the fence and the boxes we can look at those as actually traditional values. People assume that they have to be there, but really they don't. And understanding that late stage capitalism, understanding how white supremacy works, it works on people having to pay for things or get basic needs and come out of their pockets for them, rather than everyone being able to enjoy, let's say, the baseball game there, or even people being priced out of having certain accommodations or getting the best healthcare, well, I'll say it like this. And I want you to look at the wording, it's really clear. What we've fallen into the trap of is the idea of a health, and I'll quote Kimberly Crenshaw on this, is the idea of a health marketplace rather than health care. Think about the wording. We've commodified healthcare, the well-being and keeping people alive, into a market-based economy, right? Now, the danger in that is clearly this. The danger is that some people get stuff, some people don't get stuff based on what they could pay. And honestly, that's filtered over into our collegiate recovery programs. This to me, and I'll upload this up for everyone here. 2016 GOP SELFIE, 2018 House interns. Many people in this photo would say that these two pictures are diverse and inclusive. You know why? Because there are men and women there who all have different ideas on how the country should be governed. That's their idea of diversity. Note the absence. Note who's not there, right? So understand how power works in this nation and how it's distributed. That is not accidental, okay? That is contrived, that is made up. I believe my connection is slowing down. Again, that's Squad. I can go on about them. I'll leave it where it is, but I'll do a couple of things here. According to the study, Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies in December, people of color make up 35% of the US public and only 7% of all senior level, 7.1% of all senior level Senate staff. So there's disparities, there's inequity there. even in terms of our representative democracy, because our democracy is not built on the idea of things being shared. It's about on collecting and coalescing of power. So bear that in mind. This is, again, one of my favorite slides here. Creating is becoming aware of your privilege, not being viewed as a burden or source of guilt, but an opportunity to learn and be responsible, that we may work towards a more just and inclusive world. Here we see what's valued and what's prized in all of American society. It's whiteness, Americanism, heterosexuality, and being quote unquote able-bodied, wealth and Judeo-Christian values. I heard an argument on a news channel, whereas one person or reporter was questioning the governor of New Jersey on whether or not why aren't religious institutions open, as opposed to, during this COVID-19 thing, as opposed to why are liquor stores and these religious places, why are religious places closed and liquor stores open? What the governor didn't articulate, that one, having liquor stores open is a harm reduction strategy, so that people who won't go into acute withdrawal, alcohol withdrawal, right, won't flood the hospitals or overburden and overtaxed hospital system because of COVID-19. Right now, what people can do in terms of, and the host was trying to point out to religious liberty, and it was just like, one is a major medical thing, and one is a social thing. One is an absolute luxury for some folks. One is about reducing, they're both about reducing harm. The host couldn't see it because he felt as though he was being persecuted because of his religious beliefs, not seeing that both strategies were being done to reduce harm on the larger society. So again, he thought the host thought his values were right and absolute, and we were doing something wrong in terms of trying to reduce harm for everyone. So again, it's the idea of understanding, like, what are all of these things that are baked in and how we have to fight to work against those things. And even the fact that, one, we could talk about the idea of equity and fairness are bad words, you know, in our current climate. But again, all of this stuff filters over into our collegiate recovery programs. Again, this is old stuff here, talking about ableism, classism, racism. I'll blow up the slide there so you can see it. One of the things that people don't really recognize at the very beginning is that, I'll tell you two quick facts, two quick AA or Alcoholics Anonymous facts. Bill W. couldn't finish college at first because he suffered from anxiety and depression, because he couldn't get the support that he needed, because one, it wasn't available when he went to school in the early part of the 20th century. The other part of it was that he created AA because of the stigma associated with being an alcoholic. He was trying to fight ableism by creating a society of people who could go and be anonymous, right? And that was an egalitarian society. And not recognizing or seeing, because he had his own privileges, he couldn't see the limitations with what he was trying to create. But initially it was started with the idea of trying to stop ableism. And he could not get adequate healthcare. And he saw a gap that needed to be filled. And then, but what happened is, like, he didn't see his own biases, and other people who were invited into that community couldn't see their own biases, and made it harder for other folks to feel a part of. And there was actually a debate as to whether or not Black folks could be a part of the 12-step community. And the first 12-step meeting was for Black folks that was recognized, was started by a Cleveland doctor, because he needed to have the status, right, in order to be a legitimate meeting. He just couldn't have been a regular alcoholic who wanted to help out folks. I'll go back to the working definition of recovery from SAMHSA. Process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive towards their full potential. Again, it's very individualistic. It's very Eurocentric centered in terms of people living a self-directed life. Not that it's necessarily bad, it's just understanding that everything that we make and create is based in context. Why are CRPs started? This is where we're at. And I'm gonna get there and wrap up in a minute, because there's still a lot of ground to cover throughout this whole thing. But understand CRPs were started, one, to help defeat ableism so that students can feel whole and they can feel like whole people while they were going to college. Understand that college by nature is classist and elitist. And the old thinking was the boys will be boys because our systems were normed on the mythical standards of whiteness, masculinity, ability, money, and cis-sexism and heteronormism. So a lot of the stuff that kept a lot of people in the shadows in recovery in college were perpetuated for a long time. And we had a couple pioneers who saw the need, but in that need, it still served the same folks who were able to participate in collegiate recovery programs, which were white men. And occasionally, we had a few members of the LGBTQ community and maybe a sprinkling or two of people of color in traditional four-year universities. Most times people stuck with the group that they felt most comfortable with and used college as secondary. The idea of collegiate recovery programs being on campus was unheard of, and it was almost anathema. And it sounded like a crazy idea, but nevertheless, it's one that we've seen flourish and take off over time. But understanding where we're at is key to making collegiate recovery programs better. For a time, they served a particular group, but collegiate recovery programs, just like our students and just like us, grow, evolve, and change. So part of this is being aware and understanding what diversity is. Again, don't like the term, but I'll go with it for right now. It's understanding that each individual is unique and recognizing our individual differences. The danger for many of us is that we love homogeneity. We like things the same because they make us feel safe. The trouble is that we don't get an opportunity to celebrate our differences. We don't get an opportunity to show what other people are bringing to the table, which honestly, I believe is something that's damaging to collegiate recovery because one, if you have the same ideas flowing around, it doesn't give collegiate recovery programs the one to expand, to change, and to be flexible in these times, because not everybody that's going to need collegiate recovery is going to be the same. But we're going to be stuck in the same thinking and wondering why we aren't growing our programs and why they're not sustainable. And why don't we have connections with other groups, and why do people run away from us? And now there's a component also of collegiate recovery programs, and that we are a Swiss Army knife, because our underlying or underpinning ethos here is that we're here to support students in recovery. And that means students wherever they are in their recovery journey, and that's supporting them. But we need to be aware and understand what it means to have those folks in that process and in that conversation, and us being flexible. I'm going to blow through a few more slides. The slides will be available. This is, again, understanding more of the inequities that go on, understanding that one, how disparities exist in terms of education. 71% of whites have a bachelor's degree, 29% of people of color. Understanding that one, why is it needed? Because liberation or diversity or acceptance is the absolute goal. We want our students to feel free and to be free when they walk into these spaces, or have the opportunity to expand their world and understand who they are without the idea of being judged, not even beyond judge. And I even go back to Ibram Kendi when he talks about microaggressions, the idea of not being assaulted when they come into our collegiate recovery programs. Because yeah, we use Derlin Sue used the word microaggressions, but ultimately they're assaults on a person. They're assaults verbally. And we've heard people say, well, if you're going to be offended, you're going to be offended, just deal with it. But what people often miss is the aggregate of all of those assaults, one, and then the emotional toll that it takes and the psychological toll that it takes on folks. And oftentimes we put people who are in a down position or a marginalized place to be the ones to speak up and speak out about it. And that's a lot of emotional work that's unfair for them to do. That's asking the person who's been most harmed to do the most work to make a situation right. And that's not really fair. And that's not about what equity and justice is all about. And that's also about learning how to share power. And I think that's where we often fall short, is really empowering our students to have a voice in the work that we do. Again, why are anti-racist and liberated spaces needed? The slide is there, but I'll go into this. People need to be and feel represented in certain spaces in order for them to grow. And here, I'll make it really basic. The idea of this is that you don't necessarily need or have to have, let's say, a Black therapist work with a Black student, because there still could be a whole different generational values and a whole other thing. Because all skin ain't kin. So, but it's the idea of this is like, I know when I walk into a space, I'm gonna be welcome and accepted. Meaning, do we have policies that overtly state that we are not just welcoming, but this is the place where people can flourish and thrive and be understood and be accepted as they are? Is this a place that can handle conflict? Can we be a container for somebody that's going through stuff, not just the idea of like, well, I'm struggling in my recovery, but I'm also need help understanding all of the intersections and the identities and how they play out and why it took me this long to get into recovery, or why I got into recovery so soon, or understanding the resources and the power dynamics that are at play that don't allow certain groups in. And are we willing to stand up and in some cases, let our programs go in order to stand up for what is right? You know, are we willing to stand up for the most marginalized and the most oppressed? There's a thing called liberation theology that started, because I went to seminary, but I won't go into it. But basically, my life verse is Matthew 25:40. And basically, it's just a line that says, basically it's this, it's just Jesus is saying, you know, if you're a Christian, you believe Jesus is God. So, but he's saying, what you've done for the least of these, you've done unto me. So I look at it like this: whoever I do anything for, I'm doing it with the idea that one, because God is in that person. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. I'm doing it not for that person today, but I'm doing it also for the generation to come and the generation that has not been there yet. Because it's my job and my responsibility to set the table to make sure that the person who wants to come in to collegiate recovery can come into collegiate recovery without any hesitation, without any barriers, or without feeling ashamed of who they are. And it's accepting people. You know, we talk about it in the field, if you're a therapist, like accepting people where they're at and hoping to get people where they want to be. So I'm going to move forward. Why are anti-racist and liberated spaces needed? I think I kind of covered that. Again, it's the idea of lifting people out of the mire of being stuck in a system that doesn't work for them, that often dismisses them, and that quite frankly often kills them. You know, that's part of this work. At least be able to provide people at least one space on our campus where they can sit down and literally just sit and be themselves and explore themselves fully. We're going to run out of time. There's about another minute left, but the slides are here. These are questions. Is it clear why diversity is needed? Other reasons why diversity and social justice is needed. I could go on about the 4 I's of oppression. The slides are here. The presentation is going to be recorded. But just understand that the 4 I's of oppression are ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. I'll flip through some, but understand this, is that the idea of this thing is not so that people can actually, it's okay not to like certain people, but it's the idea of having and building a better, a more just society and a place where people can actually be who they need to be. And understanding that a lot of things that we assume are just hard-boiled or baked into who we are as people, especially in college, especially in the world, need to be understood in the line of critical thinking and dismantling assumptions, and understanding that this is hard work and that we are in solidarity with young folks who want to make sure that everybody who wants recovery can get recovery. So, and understanding all the factors and all the things that come into place. Oftentimes, especially a lot of white folks who do this work think that like, oh, I'll just be a nicer person. It's larger than that, and it's better than that. And that one, what we're doing is learning how to share power and to make a world a better place for all of us, not just a select few, and understand and see how power coalesces at the top and how we all have a shared piece in all the work that we're doing. This doesn't just benefit marginalized folks, because the longer we live, the longer we'll find out you will be a part of a marginalized population. We'll be less able-bodied, less financially powerful, and we'll be an older population who will need adequate health care. And again, we're seeing a lot of this stuff being played out again and right in front of our faces with what's going on with COVID-19 and how and who gets what and how people are responding to what's going on. So thanks for listening. Again, the slides are here. I think we can mail out the slides because it's just so much. And again, I said this was not time to do a super deep dive. I could probably do this in 4 or 5 webinars, but this is just really just basic stuff for folks who are just kind of whetting people's appetite to understanding how we can make collegiate recovery spaces less oppressive and anti-racist and open to folks who are interested in doing this work. So that being said, I guess I can turn it over.
Yeah.
Because I want to leave time for questions.
Thank you so much, Keith. That was wonderful. Just as a reminder to everyone, like Keith said, we are uploading everything to YouTube and then it will be on our website. Questions can be asked in the Q&A box. We have a couple in and we'll be answering those until the top of the hour. So one of the questions we've had is, can you elaborate on how SAMHSA's definition of recovery is Eurocentric?
Well, anything that's kind of self-directed, it takes an individualistic frame. And anything that's based on an individualistic frame is essentially a very Eurocentric model. It doesn't take into account that most people really heal in community. So being self-directed doesn't really take into account, and actually the idea of one building recovery capital is a collective work. People don't get better in isolation. So to say that someone is now self-directed is like, what does that mean? You know, it's the idea of like, where are they going with that? Like, yeah. I have had no direction before. It speaks to the idea that like, one of the things I kind of push back against is the idea of resiliency. And I look at the idea of resiliency almost like a rubber band. And it's the idea that a rubber band can go back to its original state. But for some folks who have been engaged in active addiction, there is no original state. They've started in a place that has been dysfunctional, a place that's been painful. So recovery is really something new. So to say that they could somehow be self-directed individually doesn't speak to the collective work that needs to be done to help prop that person up and allow them to move on. And again, the idea of this pulling oneself up by the bootstrap is really an American principle. And we don't really look at the idea that everything that we thought of in terms of health always comes out of a cultural context. It's never done in isolation. So that's why I rail against the idea of SAMHSA, like, oh, it's self-directed. Like, it's really not fair, like self-directed. Yeah, I get it. You wanna empower the individual, but how does that done? What does that look like for that person? How do you make it happen? So hopefully I answered that question.
Yeah, that was awesome. I've got another one. How can we take the burden off people of color to explain to others what microaggressions are?
Who asked that question? That is fire. But I want to hear it again. Say it again for the people in the back.
How do we take the burden off people of color to explain to others what microaggressions are?
You know, Google is a wonderful, wonderful thing. It is super powerful. None of this stuff is like a mystery in terms of like, in terms of getting information, right? There are a lot of good books out there. And one of the books I'll tout is this one. You can't see it, it's backwards. It's called Me and White Supremacy by Layla F. Sayad.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book. It's a quick and easy, like, was it like a 30-day journey in understanding a person of privilege, understanding their relationship to white supremacy and learning how to be a better ally. So again, there's so much information out there that, you know, people of color don't have to be the go-to like right away. And also, I encourage people to be honest about their intentions. And I think oftentimes people ask questions about issues like this that are really thorny, but I say, like, help somebody out, help a person of color out and explain what's your intention, like, and be a little bit more transparent in asking that question. And if they don't want to answer, respect it.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Another question, can you talk about how we could put together a coalition of anti-racist advocates in collegiate recovery in an act of social and reparative justice?
Oh my God, wow.
In 2 minutes.
Well, you know what? I'm going to push back because that's not really a fair question, because in that question is already the answer. And that question is already power. And that question is you already answering that question is knowing what needs to be done. And sometimes, and I'll say this until the day I die, stop asking for a place at the table, make your own space, because nobody's going to give you anything. So if you, hey, take my email, all my information, I would love to do it. I've tried to do it in the past, but it's hard work, you know, and not that I don't want to do it and not that other people don't want to do it. Understand that there's so many things that are diverting us from being able to do hard work like that, you know?
Yeah.
But I'm down. And I'll be transparent. Like, one of the things that we just started in our counseling center at Rutgers is really starting, it used to be called the Diversity Committee. Then the name changed to the Justice and Equity Team, where it's a bunch of therapists who are just like, yo, white supremacy has to stop in our space. And what we're trying to confront is, one, elitism. Like, why are PhDs getting all the promotions? Why social workers and LPCs are just as qualified? Leadership and management are two totally different things. But that's something that one person started a whole thing and a bunch of other folks jumped on, and we're about that work. Because honestly, like, it's rough out here in these streets.
Yeah. All right, well, that's all we have time for. So we hope that the session was helpful and that everybody will share this session with their colleagues and fellow students. Stay connected with ARHE to learn more about future webinars and let us know how we can improve our offerings. Keith, thank you for taking the time today to present. It was amazing. We appreciate everyone's time and hope to see some of you at our next webinar, which will be next Wednesday, April the 22nd at 1 p.m. Eastern, with Kateri Kahos of an overview of the Wellbriety movement in Native American community. Thank you to everyone for joining us. We appreciate it.